Hi, this is Melanie from Artifact and Landmark. Today's episode is about Windsor Glass Works and its founders. This Pittsburgh Glass Works operated from 1886 until about 1891, just a short 5 years that was filled with misfortune. So due to the business disruptions and tragedies, it's not surprising that Windsor glass is hard to find and definitely hard to collect. Although you can still find a limited amount of Windsor glass pieces at auction online and in a few museum collections, some pieces may be reproductions by L.G. Wright in the crescent line, also known as the Jersey swirl pattern. You can see in this book some photos, specifically the Jersey swirl compotes, which are stylistically very different in the stem from the original pieces, which you can see here. The company also had a few patents assigned to them, including one that describes a toothpick or match holder in the form of a blacksmith's anvil by Henry Franz, the mold department head for the company. The Glassworks factory was located in Homestead, Pennsylvania, which is about 7 miles down the Monongahela River from the point in Pittsburgh on the west bank. Homestead was mainly known as a steel town, but Windsor Glass also happened to be right across the street from another glassworks, Bryce, Higbee Co, which we'll talk about in an upcoming video. Now, the glassworks did have some of the best businessmen of the day behind it, but their backgrounds were far removed from the glass industry. They traded in groceries, hardware, and all seemed to have their hand in oil and gas. It's also important to point out that during this time, these same men were busy founding another company, the Duquesne Steel Works, which would eventually be bought by Andrew Carnegie. So I'll first introduce you to the founding members. So the first one is William H. Alldred, who's born on December 25th, 1843, and starts his career in the hardware trade on the south side of Pittsburgh. He will partner with several of the Trautman brothers, including Christian, establishing a hardware business at 1803 Carson Street, which is right next door to the Trautman's grocery business. William also partners with George Trautman to establish Windsor Glass and other companies. William Alldred never marries, but his brother John marries into the Bryce glass family and will eventually sell off the Glassworks property in 1919 to Andrew Carnegie's companies. William's partner, George Trautman, is born October 26, 1841, and marries Emma Alldred on August 11, 1868, and Emma is William Alldred's sister. They have no children. George Trautman will first work for his family grocery business at 1801 Carson Street in partnership with his brother Adam Trautman. Adam will later briefly become a manager at Windsor Glass. George also becomes a director of the Southside Savings Bank in 1869, and he becomes involved in the oil and gas industry along with William Alldred. Now, we don't know exactly why William Alldred and George Trautman decide to become partners in this glass business, but we can certainly speculate. Of course, William's brother John is married to Mary Bryce, the daughter of a prominent glass manufacturer, which isn't a surprise since the south side of Pittsburgh, where they're trading, was the main area for glassworks in Pittsburgh. We also don't know why they end up in the oil and gas industry, but we do know that some of their first investments with H. Sellers McKee and Stuart McKee of McKee Glass. These energy partnerships start in 1880 with the founding of People's Glass Light Company of the South Side, soon followed by People's Electric Light Company in 1881 and the Fuel Gas Company in 1881. They're also part of the board of the South Side Gas Company in 1882. So another Southside native and Windsor Glass founder is Robert B. Brown. He is born on July 12, 1846 to John and Rebecca Brown, who are major landowners who have turned into real estate dealers who lived at what was called Berry Hall Farm at the foot of 27th Street on the south side. Robert married Sarah Davis on September 26, 1872. They have 3 daughters. Robert would first join his father's real estate business and then manage the Herald Printing Company in the early 1880s, but by 1883 he's on the board of the Southside Gas Company, and by 1884 he's president of the Fuel Gas Company. He will also go on to form other partnerships with their first 2 partners, William Alldred and George Trautman. By 1886, the founding of the Glass Works, these 3 men would be in their 30s. Robert Brown would be 35, William Alldred would be 37, and George Trautman would be 39. Before founding the Glass Works, these men would sell their interest in the gas companies in 1885 to another gas partner and famous businessman of Pittsburgh, D. Herbert Hostetter of Hostetter Bitters. So not only do they found the glassworks in 1886, but we've also mentioned that they founded a steel company along with some other additional Windsor Glass founders, including George Boulton and John W. Doubleday. Now, these two men, Boulton and Doubleday, would first meet in the gas fields just north of Pittsburgh in the oil town of Corn Planter located in Venango County in the 1860s. George Boulton was the superintendent of Columbia Oil Company on the Story Farm, and John W. Doubleday was a superintendent on the Tar Farm. They would go into business together, forming many gas companies once they made their initial fortune in the Venango oil fields. As a quick side note, the oil fields on the Story Farm were reported as one of Andrew Carnegie's early successful investments. If you visit the Oil Creek State Park today, a marker is found for the Columbia Farm on State Route 1007, which is also known as State Park Road. Now, George Boulton was born in Bedford County, Pennsylvania on November 27, 1834 to Joseph and Catherine. His father unfortunately passes in 1850, and by 1860, the family has settled in Pittsburgh. On December 8, 1860, George is 26 and marries Mary Jordan, who is 24, and they go on to have 2 girls. By 1865, he leaves his position at the railroad to become a superintendent of the Columbia Oil Company in Venango County. A few of his brothers will also move to work in the oil fields. One unfortunately passes soon after from his injuries received in a railroad accident. George remains manager until 1881. So, of course, next door to the Columbia Oil Company is the Tar Farm, which is partially run by John W. Doubleday. And by 1883, Boulton has gone into business with Doubleday, founding the Acme Gas Company, which will bring them back to the Pittsburgh region. George would be 51 years old when he becomes founder of Windsor Glass in 1886. John W. Doubleday is born to Henry and Sarah in March of 1841 in England. At the age of 7, his family migrates to the U.S., sailing on the packet ship Liverpool, which departed on February 7th, 1849. The family would settle in Brooklyn, New York. John lives with his family and works as a clerk in New York until about 1862, when we see him leaving for the oil fields and the Tar Farm. We know he makes his initial fortune at the Tar Farm as superintendent and as a stockholder. On June 11th, 1863, he marries Mary L. Taylor. They have at least 4 children, but unfortunately she passes. He remarries to Cornelia, or more affectionately known as Nellie Thayer, in about 1878. They have at least 3 children. By 1880, Doubleday is living in Franklin, Venango, but will soon move to Jamestown, New York, where he partners with George Boulton to supply gas to Pittsburgh. Doubleday will be the initial president of Windsor Glass and would be 44 when he founds Windsor Glass in 1886. The 6th partner is Addison M. Bacon. He's a bookkeeper by trade. He's born in about 1849, and he would be about 36 years old when he also founds Windsor Glass. He never marries. He stays with the Glass Works for about a year before buying Brilliant Glass Works in Brilliant, Ohio. In 1886, these 6 men will form Windsor Glass Works. Again, at first, of course, Doubleday is president, but he soon becomes more interested in the Duquesne Steel Company, and both William H. Alldred and George Trautman will become presidents of the Glass Works. Now, the location of the Windsor Glass Factory is in Homestead, Pennsylvania, and you can see it here on this map from 1902, and you can also see the Bryce, Higbee Co. Glassworks across the road. An insurance map from 1891 helps us see the works and its 13-pot furnace and shops. An additional detail found in an article is that the original buildings are painted a stone color with brown trimmings. Like many companies of the day, this glassworks had their offices in Pittsburgh. At first, their offices would be located at 6th Street, but soon they moved to rooms at the newly constructed S. Hamilton building at 91 Fifth Avenue, which becomes Hotel Antler in the early 1900s. We have a few drawings and pictures of the building here, as it was the S. Hamilton building and as the hotel. They would have been mostly located on the 4th floor. Although the company didn't follow the typical tradition of having founders as glassmen, the company did put in place some leading glass experts of the day. The first manager is James Russell, who had a long career in glass manufacturing, having recently managed Hobbs Bruckner and Company. In a few years, he'll also found the Nickel Plate Glass Works in Fostoria, Ohio, which we'll soon cover in another video. The second glass expert is Henry Franz, who previously worked for the glass works of Campbell Jones & Co. and was in charge of Windsor's mold department. Like many mold makers of the day, he is an inventor with many patents, including the Windsor Glass Anvil Novelty Celt or Match Safe seen in this patent. Although the life of the glassworks was short-lived, they did try to improve manufacturing efficiency and safety. Their immediate advantage was, of course, being close to the Monongahela River and the rail lines. They were using natural gas throughout the factory. They added ventilation and used less labor by installing grain elevators, which were used by the mixing room to deliver ingredients such as sand, lime, and soda ash. The mixing room also had a scale, and they adopted a baking powder mixing machine to mix all the ingredients instead of doing it by hand. It was claimed that it took 2.5 minutes to mix a 400-pound batch of glass. They were also very much fire safety minded and paid special attention to protecting the molds, placing them in a fireproof brick vaults with iron doors. Other fire safety measures included fire extinguishing with a steam pump, which could supply water through hoses, 2 of which were in the factory, 2 were in the packing room, and 1 was in the mold shop, and even 1 was on the roof. There is also a tank holding 170 barrels of water, which can be used to flood the factory. Fire extinguishers are also scattered throughout the buildings. The official date this work kicked off can be said to be July 31st, 1886, when their first glass batch for the works was mixed. Unfortunately, all the safeguards we previously mentioned couldn't predict the gas explosion that occurred on May 7th, 1887. The total loss was $50,000. They do rebuild the works, and this time they use iron instead of wood throughout the buildings. We do get some insight into how the company did in 1887 when the city of Pittsburgh reports revenue for the companies in the region. So Windsor Glass shows earnings of $50,000, and for comparison, other local glassworks reported revenue including Adams Work at $253,000, Atterbury at $130,000, Bryce Brothers at $187,000, Bryce Higbee Co, the firm across the way, at $50,000, Dithridge at $200,000, Doyle & Co. at $111,000, George Duncan & Sons at $198,000, King Son & Co. at $87,000, Macbeth & Co. at $300,000, McKee Brothers at $291,000, O'Hara at $179,000, Phoenix Glass at $60,000, and Richard & Hartley at $50,000. In 1888, William Alldred becomes president, and manager James Russell has already left to found the Nickel Plate Glass Works in Fostoria, Ohio. The mold department manager, Henry Franz, also leaves to form Franz & Brown. For a brief period, we see Charles H. Reed take on the role as the works manager. He had previously founded and was manager of the Duquesne Steelworks, another company within the group. Unfortunately, he leaves this position following the passing of his father, Dr. James L. Reed, who died in a building collapse on January 9th, 1889, and the building collapse was attributed to severe cyclonic winds, which also killed many other people. It's also noteworthy that Charles avoided his own tragic fate when he returned to Pittsburgh to found the Duquesne Steelworks. He had left his position at what was the Gautier Steelworks to found the Duquesne Steelworks. Now, the Gautier Steelworks was located in Jonestown, PA, which was devastated by the flood on May 31st, 1889. And the Jonestown flood was catastrophic in terms of the death toll. Now, after the departure of Charles H. Reed, Windsor Glass experiences the loss of 2 managers within that same year of 1889. The first is Emmanuel Bird, who passes suddenly of heart failure on February 23, 1889. He was about 45 years old. Now, following Bird's passing, we see George Trautman's brother Adam take on the role as manager. Unfortunately, he falls ill and passes on October 2nd of 1889. That same year in 1889, we also see George Trautman become president. So the next manager for the Windsor Glass Works is William R. Lindsay. Unfortunately, on November 26, 1890, there is another gas explosion at the factory. Now the demand for gas was of course ever increasing to the area with all the steelworks, and they were in the process of laying down a new gas line. Lindsay, along with another man, were burnt and thrown from the force of the explosion. At first, it's reported that Lindsay would recover, but he passes from his injuries the next day. Now, our final known manager is Henry Zimmer, who starts at the work in December 1890, and he reportedly comes from King's Glass. So when we get to 1891, let's go back and track where our original founders are. If we refer back to the directory of Pittsburgh from that year, we see that Robert Brown is president of the Equitable Gas Company. William H. Alldred is secretary of the Equitable Gas Company. And of course, they have their offices at the same location as the Glass Works in Pittsburgh in the S. Hamilton building at 91 Fifth Avenue, and they're in room 413. George Trautman is president of the Southside Gas Company. And George Boulton is listed as being in business with his brother Alex, but we believe he's retired. In the year before, in 1890, we see him listed as vice president of the Allegheny Bessemer Steel Company, which is bought, of course, by Andrew Carnegie at the end of 1890 and becomes the Duquesne Steel Mill. In an article from 1891, we see John W. Doubleday is reported as secretary of the Duquesne Steel Mill, indicating that he pretty much stayed on after their company, Allegheny Bessemer Steel, was sold to Carnegie in 1890. Now, a few things did happen in 1891 that affects the owners of the Glass Works. In May of 1891, Windsor Glass were in the process of trying to repair a gas line. When they turn on the gas again, they fail to note that the grates that were supposed to help provide ventilation to the work are not put back in place, causing cold air to fill the pipes, which of course cools the batches of glass, ruining them. Due to the timing, because it's May, the works were essentially shut down early for the summer break, and it's unclear if they ever started up again. In 1891, we also see a lawsuit brought against the Equitable Gas Company, which included two of our Glassworks founders, Robert Brown, who is president of Equitable Gas, and William H. Alldred, secretary of that company. The issue that was brought up was that the investors felt that the executives, our two glass founders, were making decisions for their personal benefit, which undoubtedly affected the works. In 1892, although the works really aren't in operation, we do see rising conflicts between the company and the unions would reach this violent peak. Of course, the home of the Glass Works is a scene of a violent conflict between Carnegie Steel Company and the workers from the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers Union. This conflict resulted in 10 deaths, which would go on to haunt Andrew Carnegie. By 1893, the works are dormant, with the Glass Cooperative looking to lease out the property, which they never do. In 1894, an article notes that the fixtures and the stock have been shipped out of the building, further noting this work has been idle for 2 years. In 1895, there are articles that suggest the works will restart, and actually pointing to disagreements between the stockholders as the reason for the works being idle. This plan, it seems, never comes to fruition. In 1897, we see that Carnegie is trying to extend his rail lines over the Windsor Glass property, which causes a legal dispute. That same year, George Trautman passes at the age of 65. In 1919, the property is sold to Carnegie for $100,000. At the sale, the president of Windsor Glass is listed as Leighton H. Campbell and the secretary as John Alldred, who is the brother of William Alldred, one of our founders, and an in-law of the Bryce Glass family. By the time the property is sold in 1919, the only surviving founder of the Glassworks is John W. Doubleday, who passes in 1923. So we'll close out with a few insurance maps of the property from when it went idle in 1891 to about 1913. I hope you enjoyed this history of Windsor Glass. Subscribe to learn more about the history of U.S. Glassworks and important landmarks.